through this summary of the 40 rules of love, you'll get a front row glimpse into the life of an almost 40-year-old woman, mother, housewife, and unhappy human being, Ella Rubinstein. She is a fictional character created by the author Elif Shafak, but to many she may feel as real as it gets. A housewife looking to reignite the spark of love in her life, but not just in a romantic way. Ella, who has recently started a new job, has to review a novel which is the story of Rumi and Shams of Tabriz, called Sweet Blasphemy. The book is a story within a story, introducing us to Shams's 40 rules of love, categorized as 5 elements of nature: water, air, earth, fire, and void. She gets so engrossed in the book and the story that it makes her do something that she wouldn't otherwise do with her life. And then in the fall of 2008, she files for a divorce to end a 20-year marriage. Why? We'll tell you soon. Along with finding yourself drawn, moved, and enlightened by Ella's story through the real-life stories of Rumi and Shams, you will also traverse through the vast landscape of spirituality. You'll feel drenched in the world of Sufism, a nice kind of drenched that leaves you feeling refreshed if not liberated. The summary will give you peeks into the love story of the famous poets Rumi and Shams. But will you be able to understand the depths of love they shared? This award-winning book, which was shortlisted for the Booker, explores 2 love stories in 2 different timelines. Almost 2 different universes. If you've ever been in love or want to be, let's go. You are listening to the audiobook summary of the 40 Rules of Love by Elif Shafak, only on Audible, an Offspin production. That balmy Saturday afternoon in spring. The book begins by introducing us to Ella and her life through one Saturday afternoon when Ella, her husband, her aunt, and 3 kids are having a late afternoon lunch. The discussion about Ella landing a job as a book appraiser at a prestigious book agency begins. Jeanette, her older daughter, who had just started college, springs the news on them that she will get married to her boyfriend, Scott. Everyone is shocked, and Jeanette repeatedly snaps at her mother, asking if she had even been in love. After Ella continues to disapprove, Jeanette tells her that she was projecting her fears onto her daughter and that the last thing she wanted to be in the world was to turn out like her mother. With a few more conversations, Jeanette's issue becomes Ella's. Her husband David asks her if she has married him despite not being in love with him. That's what she confesses. She was in love back then. Interrupted by a phone call from her new employer, Ella learns that she has a new book to appraise. And she had 3 weeks to write a report about this book called The Sweet Blasphemy. Ella argues with her boss that this isn't the kind of book she can relate to and tries to get out of it, but in vain. Plagued by the problems of her life, her kids and her husband, she picks up the book written by an author named A.Z. Zahara, who lived in Holland. She finds a note that introduces her to the book set in 13th century Konya. The note says it is about Rumi, the famous poet, and Shams of Tabriz, a dervish known for his scandals and surprises. Ella opens the book, reads a few lines about the author, and finds that they are exactly opposite to the advice that she had just given to her daughter. As she keeps reading, she starts feeling overwhelmed. It was as if the book was written for her. Pushing away her feeling to stop reading that book, she flips a page and begins reading the first chapter. Starting with the letter B. Zahara's novel, which Ella reads, mentions the Quran and its verse Al-Fatiha. It says that every chapter of Sweet Blasphemy shall start with a B. B for Bismillah, a holy letter. We are introduced to Jalal ad-Din Rumi, a poet and an Islamic scholar also called Maulana. It says how in 1288 Rumi met Shams of Tabriz, and that encounter changed the course of both their lives. They didn't know that this bond would be talked about for centuries to come, and that it would transform Rumi from a cleric to a mystic, an advocate of love, and lead him to be the inventor of the famous Sufi dance of dervishes. But who could tolerate an unconventional bond, something most did not understand? Soon Rumi and Shams became targets. 3 years after they met, they were brutally separated. But did the story end there? Before we dive more into sweet blasphemy from Ella's perspective, the author introduces us to a small chapter about an assassin tasked with killing a dervish for a price he could name. After refusing to kill a holy man, he agrees to that large amount of money. In the chapter which we hear from the perspective of this assassin, we are also told whether the assassin succeeded or failed in his attempt, and if it was possible for him to determine that at all. Listen to the complete audiobook to dive into this mystical world. Shams, the brawl at the inn. We know now that the 40 rules of love are categorized according to the elements of nature. Part 1, called Earth, begins with a story of Shams. He finds himself at an inn in Samarkand, having a vision about being murdered and pushed into the well, with one strange man calling his name. When the innkeeper brings him back to reality, he has a conversation with him about God, with the innkeeper constantly criticizing God. He criticizes dervishes like Shams, calling them madmen. While the innkeeper and Shams argue, a brawl begins at the inn. After the brawl, the innkeeper asks Shams to pay for the food and rent. While Shams had initially offered to interpret his dreams because he did not have any money, he instead offered to read his palm. What Shams says after reading his palm leaves the innkeeper dumbfounded. Listen to the complete audiobook to know what happened next. When the innkeeper lets him sleep there one more night, Shams finds himself quite lonely. He starts to think of the time when people dismissed his visions. The first person that came to his mind was his father, who misunderstood his visions. He feared that the villagers would think he was crazy. As he grew up, his visions did not stop, and he soon left home. After leaving home, Shams talks about the experiences he encountered, and from those experiences came the 40 rules of love. As Shams reached a certain age, he felt the need to hand over those rules of love to someone. He was not seeking a mentor or a disciple, and the author writes that Shams asked God to help. And God did. He asked him to go to Baghdad. Ella, when Jeanette did not come home. We jump back to Ella's story, where she is still reeling from the disappointment of learning how her daughter Jeanette wants to get married. Desperate, she calls Jeanette's boyfriend Scott to try to talk them out of the idea. This call, which does not go as planned, has a boomerang effect, and David calls Ella, saying because of that call, Jeanette has decided to stay with her friends. David follows suit and says there is an emergency and decides not to come home either. It was the first time David had not come home, despite cheating on her multiple times in the past. This leaves Ella heartbroken. While sitting at the dinner table, alone and lonely, Ella realizes something she has been denying all along. Later, as she looked at the book Sweet Blasphemy again, she decided to Google the author. She lands on his website and discovers that the author's first name is Aziz. On finding his email address, she writes him an email about how she disagrees with what he writes in the book, despite enjoying it quite a bit. She offers to meet over a cup of coffee should he travel to Boston, as Aziz is a traveler. After sending that email, Ella went to sleep. When she woke up at 3:45 in the morning, still not finding David next to her or a call back from her daughter, she couldn't go back to sleep. She opened her email and found a reply from Aziz, a beautiful one. To listen to the response, get to the complete audiobook. Shams in Baghdad. Returning to Shams's story, we learn about his time in Baghdad. We hear this story from the perspective of someone who works at the Dervish Lodge in Baghdad where Shams stayed. The identity of this person is not revealed. Shams has some powerful suggestions about God and what God does. He suggests that the perfect place to find God, as one of the rules of love, was not to look in mosques, temples, churches, or other places of worship. God can be found in the heart of a true lover. Shams, who talks to Baba Zaman, another spiritual person at the lodge, says that a vision had brought him to Baghdad. He explains how he never dreams when Zaman refuses to understand Shams's visions. The unnamed young novice, through whose perspective we hear about Shams's time in Baghdad, eavesdrops on this conversation, but is convinced that Shams already knows about his presence. When he feels that he has been discovered, he runs as far and fast as possible. We fast forward to 9 months later, where Shams is still at the same lodge looking for someone to pass on his spiritual knowledge to. Then one winter, a messenger arrives with a letter. That letter was destiny, the bridge between Shams and Rumi. Next, we switch back to Shams's perspective. He looks at all the curiosity that has been generated since the letter's arrival. He hears what it says from Baba Zaman, which you can listen to in the complete audiobook. After hearing those words, Shams finds himself thinking about loneliness and solitude. He talks about the difference between being alone and lonely. When Baba Zaman asks the dervishes at the lodge about who would like to go and accompany Rumi, after learning about his existence in the letter, 10 people, including Shams, raise their hands. But then something makes them all back out. Shams remains, but Baba Zaman has not permitted him to go. He has to wait until the spring, and with that we learn a beautiful thing about patience. The young novice makes a surprising request to Baba Zaman, asking to accompany Shams on his journey to meet Rumi. Baba Zaman agrees to let Shams go and gifts him 3 items in a velvet box that would help him on this journey that was supposed to be dangerous. Konya was the next destination. The young novice decided to trail Shams without him finding out, but at a point he has no option and reveals himself. Listen to the complete audiobook to know the exact dialogue between Shams and the young novice. Ella, the wish. Returning to Ella's life, the author tells us about her love for cooking and how it was an escape. The following day, when David returned home, Ella found a complicated menu to cook and got to it. At this point, we begin to see a difference in Ella's thinking. Again, while having food with her family and looking at her husband's lips, which might have kissed someone else's, something inside her snaps. And as a result of that snap, she worries she would do something that she can never imagine. As she dealt with that thought, she felt a weight lift as Jeannette, her daughter, had decided to return her call. They spoke at length, and she felt like Aziz's wish to the wishing tree in Guatemala had come true. She decided to write another email to him. And then another in the morning, which would otherwise be dedicated to breakfasts, because Ella believed that breakfasts were the most important meals of the day. In that morning's email from Aziz, he told Ella that maybe their conversations were not a coincidence. He tells her the colors of her aura and says he has bought a tapestry for her from Guatemala. He talks about another coincidence that surprises Ella so much that she loses track of everything that morning. A few days pass, and she finds herself changing. On her 40th birthday, she looks at the list of 10 things she wanted to do before she turned 40. The 10th one on her list, which needed to be accomplished or even half accomplished, was to open her heart to love. She writes an email to Aziz about how she felt dull on her birthday. Maybe it was turning 40 that day that made her feel down in the dumps. Aziz responds to her email by saying that the mystics believe turning 40 is an ascent from one level to another. The 40s are a significant age. He talks at length about the significance of 40, relating it to birth, death, the flood of Noah, Jesus' time in the wilderness, the degrees between man and God, the number of days for which Buddha meditated. All had the number 40 entwined in them. It was an important time of her life, when she was to receive a new mission. Grey hair, wrinkles, or anything else could not defy the power of 40. As the book progresses, we learn more about Ella, her childhood, and how she was never a rebellious girl. How she had lost interest in sex, gained a lot of weight, and her suspicions about her husband cheating on her started growing. And above all, how she blamed herself for everything that had gone wrong. Then she asks God for something, to either find her the love she deserved or make her indifferent to the absence of it. Rumi, the full moon sky. Much later in the book, we hear from the perspective of Rumi for the first time. He talked about the full moon in the night sky. His wife, Effendi, awakened and asked Rumi if he had seen the same dream again. This dream that Rumi experienced was about him reading the Quran in a strange place with a dervish, someone he had never met before. He goes on to explain his dream in elaborate detail, and surprisingly, parts of his dream resemble that of Shams. The well, the murder, the screaming. We learn about the void Rumi faces despite having everything one could wish for in life. Shams. The arrival in Konya. When Shams is about to arrive in Konya, among many other things that happen to him, he receives a warning. He would either experience pure love or pure hatred. He talked about sitting under an oak tree and looking at the minarets when a peasant offered him a lift. That's when we are introduced to another rule of love, which says that we are all unfinished works of art and a bit more of mind-bending advice. The peasant tells him about Rumi and how it is remarkable. If one listens to Rumi, the sadness is cured, no matter how great it is. Later, Shams decided to learn more about the town before meeting Rumi. After he had made his observations, he found it akin to the Tower of Babel. While wandering around town, Shams ends up near a brothel. His exchange with the sex worker there leads to another teaching about love. After this point in the book, we hear stories from different people in the Shams-Rumi universe. We learn about their trials, emotions, and how they get help and support from Shams and Rumi at different points in their lives. Ella's sweet blasphemy. As Ella and Aziz's exchanges over email become more frequent, sometimes 5 times a day, Ella realizes that talking to him is an escape from her mundane life. And she thinks that for a married woman, talking to a strange man more than she did with her family was blasphemy. The author writes that by the time Ella finished appraising Shams's book, they had begun calling each other daily. And this was still Ella's secret. Her behavior with her husband changed. She no longer feigned ignorance. He knew that she knew about his affairs. Pun intended. A few days later, we learned that Ella and Aziz had shared their first photographs, and Ella found that Aziz looked just like how he had described the Shams of Tabriz in his book. This intrigues her, so much so that she involuntarily wonders what it would be like to kiss him. The letters that Ella and Aziz exchange are written delightfully by the author in the complete audiobook. They highlight the maturity of their bond, the deep discussions they have, and how fond they had grown of each other. Shams meeting Rumi, and Rumi meeting Shams. Shams and Rumi meet for the first time after Rumi has delivered his usual sermon at the mosque. Shams asks Rumi a question as people watch, and Rumi answers that difficult question with wisdom. As Shams got closer to Rumi, they recognized each other. They were the men in their dreams. Rumi writes that on knowing this face, he experienced cold dread. Rumi talks about the 7 stages of truth after thinking about the question Shams asked him. How big was Rumi's cup? What stage of truth was he at? Was the next question Shams asked. This marks the beginning of many of the conversations Shams had with Rumi. We learn about those mind-opening ideas in the complete audiobook. In the words of the author, Rumi opens up his heart about Shams, what it meant to have him in his life. He was someone who made him realize what he was missing in his life, like a mirror that showed him the void he experienced, and in a way filled it. Then he urges everyone to find that person or persons. It could be a lover, a friend, a child, anyone. Shams taught Rumi to unlearn everything. Their friendship elevated him. The author writes that love cannot be explained, but love explains everything. We learn when Rumi first starts to think of poetry, when both of them ride outside of town and sit under the same oak tree that Shams had picked when he was coming to Konya for the first time. Rumi finds love in Shams despite the entire town calling him eccentric and unworthy of his attention. The author writes about a time when Shams asked something unusual of Rumi: to get 2 bottles of wine from the tavern, spend time there and talk to the people. Rumi trusts him and does that. What Shams does with the wine is mystical, magical even for Rumi. To find out what happens next, listen to the complete audiobook. Ella, the dinner. From Ella's perspective, the author writes how her husband David took her out for dinner. Ella soon feels out of place. She thinks it would be a quiet dinner, as often she and David had nothing to talk about despite being together for 20 years. But David had something to say. He says that he knows about her affair with Aziz, and that he was ready to forgive her, because he had looked for compassion elsewhere. Flabbergasted and angry, Ella tells David that she loves Aziz. Later that night, after sleeping in separate beds from her husband for the first time, she pours her feelings into a letter to Aziz. Soon after, Aziz flew down to Boston to see her. After some back and forth with David, Ella decides to go to Boston at that moment instead of the following day. To know the story of what happens when they meet, listen to the complete audiobook. But you should also listen to the complete audiobook to know the heartbreaking thing that happens to Ella and Aziz when Ella shows interest in accompanying him to Amsterdam. It is not how you'd expect their story to end. Rumi and Shams, the whirling Sufi dance, and the assassin. For the narrow-minded, dancing and whirling were odd and unacceptable. Despite that, Rumi, Shams, and 6 other dervishes had decided to perform. This and everything that had been happening between Shams and Rumi became blasphemy, distancing Rumi from the ruler of Konya. That was difficult for him because he was used to a life of privilege. Shams knew that his time in Konya was coming to an end, because he knew that with poetry, dance, and love, Rumi's transformation was done, and it was time for him to leave. With love comes heartache. When Shams finally leaves, Rumi finds himself devastated. Rumi's son told him that things would be different this time and people would not be that scornful. Shams asks him not to make such promises and agrees to return to Konya one more time. But something shocking, entirely unexpected happens to Shams in Konya. A series of shocking incidents until an assassin enters their lives. Rumi and Shams, Ella and Aziz. The stories of Rumi and Shams and Ella and Aziz might be very different, yet very similar. In this summary, we won't reveal how they end, because what is important is what they went through together, and if, as the author writes in the book, love ever has an end. Their stories, relatable and full of teachings, are not merely a list of 40 rules of love you can read and understand. They are packed with emotions and, despite being fiction for a large part, feel real. In a time when love has been defined through movies and pop culture, the book sheds a bright spiritual light on it. It is difficult to understand love. In real life, Shams and Rumi faced the wrath of those who did not understand them. There might be an Ella or an Aziz in you, waiting to find love and settling for what you have. No matter who you are in your heart, the complete audiobook will masterfully help and challenge your ideas of love. The 40 Rules of Love is an audiobook you can listen to repeatedly and still learn new things every time.